and welcome to Candidates Corner on LPTV, Libertarian Party Television, a production of the Libertarian Party and Libertarian National Committee. Whitney Bilyeu serving as chair. Tonight, as always, John Gapso on the big board. My name is Pat Ford. I'm your host. I'm proud to be the alternate delegate for Region 8, Great Region 8, Libertarian National Committee. By the way, as an aside, next week we're heading to Kentucky, Louisville, Kentucky, for the LNC meeting. We're going to talk about having a candidates corner that night, Friday night, live from the Brown Hotel in Louisville, Kentucky. So we'll keep you posted on that. It's going to be a lot of fun. If you're anywhere in that area, please feel free to stop by. There's a fundraiser Friday night. A whole heck of a lot of fun meeting during the day. And then, of course, remember, we're the party that put party in political parties. So join us Saturday night for shenanigans and hijinks. As always, there are a few purposes for tonight's show. We want to give the Libertarian Party an opportunity to meet, if you will, in the digital flesh, our wonderful down ballot candidates. What do we mean by down ballot? Well, anyone from, one of my favorites, of course, is in the state of Pennsylvania. They have municipal auditors. Libertarians are running for that in droves and occupying, if you will, one of the inner sanctums of municipal government. State representatives, state senators, town council people, board of education, water boards. One of my all-time favorites, my buddy Eric out in Colorado, running for a mass transportation district commissioner. They're all amazing opportunities to take the folks that we have now. As we always say every week, we don't use the word govern here. Use the word steward, an opportunity to steward their community's resources in a manner thoroughly libertarian, very often being the very first libertarian that many folks in their communities will ever meet, much less be, stewarded by. We want to challenge our candidates. I always call it lunch pail issues, right? The workaday issues of that district, of that town, of that congressional district, of that state, of that municipality, whatever. The issues that matter to people the most. Years ago, during the Bill Clinton campaign, the famous war room where the banner hung, "It's the economy, stupid." A constant reminder that in our case, while all of us admire Austrian economics, and all of us have a great deal of heartfelt admiration for the theoreticians, the statisticians, the individuals who make up our party philosophy, we need to remind ourselves ceaselessly that folks in regular communities who may not even be interested in politics, but worry about their children's education, they worry about their property tax rates, they worry about the ability to retire in the county or the state or the town that they're from. They're worried about their neighbor's health, but at the same time, they're also worried about their personal civil rights. Most of them don't know it, but they're libertarians. It's up to us as the stewards of both the communities and this great philosophy to introduce them to that. Finally, incredibly important, more so now than ever, that we create a bond between libertarian affiliates from around the country and now around the world to understand that the candidate running, in this case tonight, for the United States Congress in District 20 in Florida, is as important to the dissemination, if you will, to the preaching that goes on for the libertarian philosophy as their hometown candidate, maybe in Bangor, Maine, Providence, Rhode Island, or, Oregon, Washington, California. It's that important. The candidates we have running in the recall race for the governor of California, they mean a lot to us out in Rhode Island. And that's something we all need to understand. Joining us tonight for the very first time is ter Maat. He is running for the United States Congress in District 20 in the great state of Florida, the Sunshine State. Mike, thanks for joining us tonight. It's great to meet you finally.
Well, it's great to finally be with you, Pat. Long-time watcher, first-time talker, and very jealous that you're going to be at the Brown in Louisville. It's a tremendous property. You're going to have a great time and a great breakfast if you order the hot brown.
Hot brown, okay. That may happen. I'm just there may be the odd sipping whiskey or bourbon that just may happen across these lips. I'm just that is a possibility, a distinct one at that.
Good for you.
And after the week, I think Americans have had everywhere, there is a real reason for us to sit down and, whether it be a cup of coffee, a glass of root beer, or maybe a glass of whiskey, neat. I think we all need that, and a lot of that comes from, well, the body that you would like to join. There's chaos.
The BS crowd. You're talking about Congress?
I'm talking about Congress. There is chaos in the halls of Congress at every level, and you want to be there. Why do you want to join that mess?
Well, I want to represent the good people of District 20. District 20 is a place that has certain problems that are not completely dissimilar to other places in the United States, but worse in a couple of categories. It's a place of tremendous poverty, a place where the trust between police officers and the citizenry is at an all-time low. That doesn't make it completely different than a lot of other places as well. These are issues that have meant a great deal to me, both personally and professionally, for a long time. And I think that the way that we approach these issues needs to change in a very fundamental way. And I'm afraid that means that we're going to need different types of leaderships in Washington going forward.
Let's talk about your background. We always ask everyone's liberty moment, but this week you are a Renaissance guy.
I'm old. I don't know quite take credit for that.
Well, tell us about your background, and you've had a couple of careers, and let's get into some detail on that, because to me there is no greater subject matter expert than someone who has immersed themselves and made one's life work. So how did you tell us about your career path?
Well, as you know, I was an economist, a professional economist for many years. Came out of George Washington University. You mentioned you were an Austrian economics fan. Me too. Graduated from a program which was steeped in what we call rational expectations, which of course was a descendant of the Chicago school, which came from the Austrian school. Right. So I'm with you there. Worked for the federal government and around the federal government for many years in D.C., worked for the White House for a couple of years. Spent a lot of time with financial institutions, economic development.
Well, wait a minute. You don't get to, if you're a libertarian, you don't get to walk right by. Yeah, I worked at the White House. Tell us, if you will. First of all, tell us, give us a little overview of the focus you had in economics, and then tell us what you did in the White House, because that's fascinating stuff.
Well, it might sound more fascinating than it actually was. I worked for the Office of Management and Budget. My boss's boss was George Herbert Walker Bush. And so, as you might imagine, there was a fair amount of disappointment when his representatives, my boss, Mr. Darman, the oldsters in your audience might remember, was at Andrews Air Force Base cutting the deal with Congress to go back on the president's infamous
no new taxes
promise.
New taxes.
And
read my lips.
Did agree, to have people read his lips. And as it turned out, he, did agree to some of what we tried to hide as taxes, but virtually definitively they were new taxes. And it was a point of disappointment, and for a young economist who was interested in both policy and politics, it was an eye-awakening moment, right? It's a moment where you're disappointed and confused, and at the same time, you've got to grow up and learn that not everybody gets their way, and that was a tough thing. I probably had 25 jobs in my life. That was easily the worst job I've ever had, for a variety of reasons.
I mean, OMB, if you want 9 letters that should strike the fear at heart in any libertarian, it would be OMBGAOIRS. How about that? Is that a good?
Yeah, those are 9 evil ones. That's for sure.
But OMB is where they make the sausage. That's as down and dirty as government gets, isn't it?
It was. It was a Republican administration, obviously. Ronald Reagan had recently, just 5 or 6 years earlier, I believe it was in the middle of his second term, remarked at how little control he felt like he had over his administration in the deep state, what we now call the deep state. He didn't refer to it as such then. But he remarked on how relatively few presidential appointees there were to lead an administration of dozens of thousands of employees, civil servants, who were and are even more today than ever before, I believe, very pro-statist, largely democratic, certainly blue individuals who believe in the mission of government and believes that government ought to have an ever-increasing mission. And that was the environment in which we worked. It was educational and frustrating, and in some ways not unimportant, right?
Right. That was a time, really, when you look at the combined presidencies of Reagan and the one term of Bush the Elder, where you really had a sea change, if you will, not only just in executive power, but there was this overwhelming optimism that had taken over in the Paul during and immediately following the Carter years. I'm old enough to have remembered the now infamous / famous Reagan speech at the Republican convention, where it was a new morning in America.
Yeah.
And
it's where we learned to believe such things as a rising tide would lift all boats, right? We believed that hard work would pay off, and that if the government got out of the way, that's pretty much all that it would take. And for much of the economy, for many Americans, that was largely true. We did have a number of go-go years. As it turns out, to my great consternation and disappointment, studying poverty both in the United States and abroad, it turns out that while there is a great deal of mobility throughout our economy, for the most part, right, we see people moving to the upper class and the middle class, and from the upper class to the middle class all the time. We don't see that so much at the bottom rung of the ladder. People who are mired in poverty find it exceedingly difficult to get out of that. And the one thing that I have learned by hook or by crook, and not necessarily because I wish it were so, but what I have learned over the years is that poverty is a political phenomenon.
Right.
This persistent intergenerational poverty that we see all over the United States, particularly in densely populated urban areas in our cities, so much of that is driven by bad public policy, or at the very least, locked in by bad public policy, right? If it had multiple origins, certainly it is a couple specific policies that make it very difficult for there to be mobility out of poverty. And it's one of the things that drives me crazy about Washington, and one of the reasons why I take very seriously this campaign.
Now, this was also a time, since we're on the saying of buzzwords, cliches, et al., where Nancy Reagan would routinely utter, after an imperious gaze into the camera, just say no.
Just say no to drugs.
Right.
They're bad for you. You shouldn't take drugs. Stop it. Just say no.
And it was the height of the beginning of the run-up, I'll call it, of the drug war 2.0. Started in the Reagan administration, and of course, everybody's favorite crazy uncle, Joe Biden, of course, then responded just a few years later with his infamous Crime Act. So
with the crime bill in 1996, much of which we are still trying to live down. When you think about the war on drugs, the war on poverty together have caused so much mischief. And in fairness, many of us were optimistic, although we were a little skeptical at the time, right? But in both cases, you couldn't help to be optimistic because the problems were significant. You wanted something to work. If you weren't on board with the war on poverty in the 70s, you had to wonder about your ethics. None of us had enough experience to know that this wouldn't work. You could argue that the size of government needs to be held in check, but I think most everybody thought that if you brought the right resources to bear in impoverished communities, you had to be able to do some good. And
Well,
I'm sure that for some individuals, you did do some good, but as it turns out, it's largely just not only a waste of money, but undermines the way markets are supposed to work.
well, this was also a time where Ronald Reagan, um, remember the Fireside Chats by Jimmy Carter with the cardigan sweater et al., and the now hilarious takeoff by Dan Aykroyd when he on Saturday Night Live, acting as Jimmy Carter, successfully talked someone down off a brown acid trip because, well, that's the president. He saw himself as someone who could heal the nation. You bring on the Reagan years, and to me, the irony of the Reagan years was not only did it not make government smaller, it made government larger, but it also created this incredible renewal of faith in big government because he came along and invaded Grenada, and all of a sudden, America was back to business. America was in charge of wars. He raised the budget, but he made government smaller as if by magic.
Yeah. Well, it's an interesting point. And, for members of your audience, Pat, who are not 80 years old, we should point out that these problems that we have today that are so often legacies of policies that we put in place back in those days. And when I mean we, I don't mean you and I, but as a body politic, we as Americans supported these policies were quite popular at the time. The crime bill in particular in '96. Now we're struggling with the legacies of these policies, and they are particularly problematic in District 20. So I am running on a platform of criminal justice reform, as well as a reform to our approach to poverty. And those are not two different things. I'm a firm believer that the heavy hand of criminal justice in the United States is a major contributing factor to the persistence of poverty in our urban areas.
Absolutely. Tell us a little bit about your district, because I want to do a deep dive into this conversation surrounding poverty, because to me, when you look at it as you are, and I believe you're 100% on target with this, when you incorporate the drug war, poverty, immigration justice, and, if you will, the militarization of the police, you are looking at a subset of the issues underlying one disease, and the disease is poverty. So tell us a little bit about your district, its makeup. We think of Fort Lauderdale, and of course, we think of sun and sand and happy people driving IROCs and and Harleys.
Again, for members of your audience that aren't 60 years old, they hopefully think of Fort Lauderdale in a more positive way than Son of Sam. District 20 is an interesting place. Thanks for putting up the picture there. For anyone who's listening and not watching, it includes a couple of pieces of Broward County and a piece of Palm Beach County. So it includes West Palm Beach, areas that are west of Fort Lauderdale, and a little piece in southern Broward County. What all these places have in, by the way, the giant pink area to the left on your screen, to the west side of the district, is just Everglades, unpopulated Everglades. A lot of my people, it turns out to be the case, a lot of my people are alligators. So that huge pink area to the left is just completely uninhabited by human life. All of the humans are in the little juts out from the main body in pink on your screen, going from west to east. What all these places have in common is that they carefully avoid any place that might vote Republican, any place where there's a significant amount of money. This is a very impoverished set of communities brought together, significantly below the national average in terms of however you want to measure it. Income, wealth, by household, by individual, by education. Broward County schools, public schools in particular, are pretty bad by comparison to the rest of the United States, and of course to the rest of the world, and parenthetically by comparison to any other industry in the United States. Most public schools in Palm Beach County are also not very good. So that's something that the entire district has in common, and I believe is a big contributing factor to poverty and getting stuck in poverty.
So, is there any industry besides tourism? You know, we obviously Cape Canaveral is a little ways away. Military presence, I'm sure, is relatively low. But talk to us about how people make a living there.
Well, it's a densely packed urban area, and so it's not all that different from any other place. Yeah, there's a lot of avionics, a lot of tourism, heavy medical presence, a lot of medical tourism. Immigrants come through Miami now in gigantic numbers, which is a big contributing factor to the vibrant culture of South Florida in general. And so the existence of Miami as a leaping off point toward economic and other relationships with Latin America is exceedingly important. We also have a number of people retiring to our area. The tradition, well, I grew up outside of Chicago, the tradition used to be if you grew up in the Midwest, you would retire to the west side of Florida. And if you grew up in the Northeast, you would retire to the east side of South Florida. We still have a little bit of that pattern, but a lot of the money that comes into South Florida is brought in by folks retiring here. That's a major contributor. And so if you're not in a place that participates in any of the things that I just mentioned, it can be a tough place to live. We have a large immigrant population, a lot of Haitians, a lot of Hispanic immigrants in District 20. It's a very culturally diverse area, and a lot of folks settling who are learning English as a second language, who don't have either a lot of wealth or American education, American educational history behind them that's going to lead to the rapid development of careers. So some of these folks will be escaping poverty only in the next generation, and some of the people are going to be ending up sending their kids to these crummy public schools in Broward and Palm Beach and be stuck in poverty for another generation. So a little bit about District 20.
Right. So education now, I mean, this is where it becomes interesting because as a candidate, you're running for the United States Congress.
Right.
And as a result, well, let's be blunt. Anyone who's an area congressman will always, or one will have at least a political impact on what's happening locally. But ultimately, your ability to impact that comes from your interaction at the federal level. Department of Education, what are your thoughts? What direction should the Department of Education, well, first off, how quickly should we put them out of business?
To the extent to which it should exist, is there? Look, if what the federal government does to local education were done by someone besides a local government, you would consider it either bribery, treason, or some other form of corruption. Right? The federal government, quite literally, bribes states, and sometimes at a more detailed level than states, to do the things that the federal government thinks are a good idea. That's bad policy to begin with, even if the ideas were any good. It turns out that they're not. I don't think it's a complete coincidence that the federal government would take a position of control and then not do a very good job of figuring out education policy. That's probably not coincidental. You're right. It's a tricky thing to be at the federal level and care about something in the local level like school districts. But yeah, number one, we got to get the federal government out of it. We need for local school districts to have as much flexibility as possible. Now, if it were up to me, would the Justice Department be prosecuting antitrust cases against school boards for the monopoly utilization of public funds to themselves instead of making public funds that are earmarked for primary and secondary education available to private schools and certainly to charter schools. Yeah, unfortunately, the legal structure does not support that. So it is very difficult to prosecute the case in any other way besides politically in the media, that we need for public schools to have competition.
Right.
I do believe that congresspersons can have a significant impact on public discourse in this area. I think federally funded politicians ought to be able to, in a full-throated fashion, support school choice, because even though they work at the federal level, they very much care about what goes on in their individual districts. And if you represent a district like the 20th in Florida, you know not only how bad public schools can be, but you know how important they are, acting as this sort of transmission belt from one generation to the next for poverty. So yeah, the Department of Education should be doing everything it can to push the idea of charter schools and making funds available to private schools.
No, what we've got right now is this vicious cycle where money is removed from localities, churned through the Washington machine, part of it absorbed into the great maw of the bureaucracy, and then portions of that money are then returned back to regions. That's probably, in my opinion, the reason that we need to just simply end the Department of Education. It's accomplished nothing. The results have gotten dramatically worse. Full disclosure, I'm married to a teacher. Full disclosure, I am truly blessed, and for circumstances that I had no part in, I could say neither of my children ever spent a day, as Mr. Vora would call it, in theft school. So
just based on your own self-description, when you and I have chatted earlier, Pat, you're lucky to be married to anybody, much less someone as wonderful as a teacher who I know is committed to doing right by her students. Right? Teachers are wonderful people. The teachers' unions can be problematic because I frankly don't think that they understand what's in their own long-term self-interest. If they did, they would be pushing for more competition for their own members' services. Can you imagine if instead of having only one big school board in your area, you had a bunch of private schools and charter schools that were well funded, all of whom who need teachers, and now they're bidding up the salaries that are made available to good teachers. And if some of those programs weren't completely unionized, the schools would have the ability to pay the good ones more, the bad ones less, indeed to fire the bad ones, making more resources available to the good ones. A good teacher would be making more money, I believe, were it not for the unions.
Well, and all you need to know about teachers is that I was, incredibly enough, I was an accountant early on in my career. Not a really good one, but all you need to know about accountants, lawyers.
How many fingers am I holding up?
That depends. But ultimately, there are recruiters for accountants and lawyers and engineers and computer people. There's
even
entire
economists. Yeah.
There are entire industries that exist. In turn, there are no recruiters for elementary school teachers.
No, they wouldn't be able to make a buck because everyone's locked into their union.
Right.
And the same thing applies to other public sector unions. Well, actually, in the past especially, but still in certain industries, applies to unions in the private sector as well. But it's a particularly big problem in the public sector unions, of which I am a member. One thing that you and I haven't quite touched on yet, and just as well, because you and I don't want to punch each other in the face yet, metaphorically. I am a police officer here in Broward County, in southern Broward County. I've been on the road as a patrol officer for the past 11 years. It's been a second career for me, and it's been tremendous. I am a big believer in public service. There are things about it that will drive you crazy, including the fact that there are laws that you wish didn't exist. One of the things that we got to talk about is we need to stop criminalizing so many victimless behaviors the way we do,
Right.
not just in Florida, but all over the United States. And some of that, especially the drug war, is led at the federal level, although a lot of the laws are certainly
the interdiction
state.
occurs locally.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
let's get back to, if you will, the Federal Department of Education. So I
Yeah.
think it's fair we all support ending it. Fair enough. I mean, would
Yeah,
that
that's fair.
overnight eliminate? I mean, in a perfect world, you have no input into Congress, into education, because the federal government, as short of it being,
should have no input.
right. I mean, none. There is absolutely no value to the federal government being involved. And I will say that one of the few successful imports that we've got left as a nation is our secondary education. And most of that is private. People from around the world, literally, I mean, I have 2 children that are just a handful of years out of college. All their freshman roommates were from other countries, not just ethnic members of ethnic groups who lived here. They were both from countries where, quite frankly, neither of them, coincidentally, were able to establish social media connections with their freshman roommates, because they, in both cases, that social media was blocked in the nation they were coming from. So, you've got this tremendous opportunity. Now, getting back to that next pillar.
Higher education is the envy of the world.
Right. And people pay enormous amounts of money to participate in it. So
and
why not?
Largely outside of the influence of the federal government. Not a coincidence.
Right. My wife happens to teach at a prep school, a private school, the dreaded private school. She teaches at a friend's private school. Incredibly enough, a private company built a dormitory facility. Now we're talking K to 12 for high school students from Asia to live in the dorm while they attended my wife's school.
And they consider it to be worth it, and they're probably correct. It probably is worth it.
They pay enormous amounts of money to do it. So we continue, because if we're talking about urban crime and urban poverty, most importantly, one of the constant complaints about education, and that I'm hit with, and I'd be interested if you've been confronted with this yet, I'm sure you will be, is that, well, people tell me all the time, if we eliminated public education, because one of my personal hashtags is end public education. That's not too confrontational, right? The people lose their minds and say, who will guarantee equity for, students from the BIPOC community?
The market.
Right. Because they're not.
First of all, the market. Second of all, we don't have equity now.
Right. That's the big lie.
It's a huge lie. If you're in a bad public school district, it's probably because there's no money there. It's going to limit the opportunities you and your brethren have to make any money, thus continuing the impoverished nature of your school district. Your schools are going to continue to stink. You're not going to have any competition from private schools, because no private school is coming to your town because you can't afford to pay them. So you're going to be locked in. Good luck achieving equity or equanimity or whatever you want to call it in your politically correct ways this year. You're not getting there with public schools. You're just not.
Now let's talk about the impact of the drug war on the local community as it's affected again by the federal government. Now, we actually in Rhode Island the legislation just passed an approval for, you ready for this? A harm reduction center, which would allow safe shooting.
Say it again?
A harm reduction facility, which would
reduction facility.
All right, which would allow safe shooting, if you will, of drugs, chemical analysis of drugs being used, as well as an opportunity to engage in services to enter the recovery phase of one's life. What's even more incredible about this, because this is literally first in the nation, is that, are you ready for this? In the Socialist Workers Paradise, Rhode Island, it's privately funded.
Exactly.
No taxpayer money. So, and they've established, if you will, sort of a tacit agreement with the feds that there won't be drug interdictions in the immediate neighborhood of this facility, so that people will feel safe entering, if you will, sort of that, what do they call it in Iraq, a green zone, if you will? Yeah,
the periphery.
Right. So now,
it's very important. Of the many things that are wrong with the criminalization of drugs, the drug prohibition that we have going on in the United States, is that it absolutely drives a wedge between police and the communities that we serve. And I believe that due to the nature of police work and the nature of medical services that can become necessary for people who are stuck in addiction, police officers are likely to be involved in one way or another with drug addiction problems in the United States for many, many years, possibly forever. And by the way, let's not kid ourselves about the extent to which we have an opiate addiction problem in the United States. It's huge and deeply problematic for those people who are involved in it. People are extremely hesitant to call 911 when they have a problem, right? Even a medical problem, certainly a financial problem, but more importantly, a medical problem, because they're afraid that someone's going to go to jail over it.
Right.
This is a very difficult thing for us to overcome, but very important. So I guess what I'm saying is I'm not advocating that police, just have no role to play. But, whether we like it or not, police are going to have a role to play because that's what happens when you call 911. But we need a way to make it criminally safe for people to reach out, and comfortable, by the way, for police to reach out in the way that we want to also. We
Right.
don't want to be criticized for why didn't you do this or why didn't you do that? How do you decide when you do this? How do you decide when you do that? Let's not forget the police are employees, and we are subject to the policies and the laws that are in place in our communities and our states. And sometimes our flexibility is somewhat, we try to exert as much flexibility as possible, but we do not have 100% control over that. That's a real problem.
Well, let me throw this out then. In the same manner in which you remove the federal influence from education, if in fact we remove the federal influence from essentially by declassifying, descheduling, if you will, narcotics, aren't you at that point in time truly leaving the law enforcement up to, at a minimum, the state, if not, in fact, creating an environment where you could potentially retool? And I have to tell you, and this is where you and I might disagree, but I'll throw this out for you. I routinely engage in my day gig involves the media, and I spend a lot of time in communities in difficult circumstances, in drug interdiction and all that. I actually believe, and hear me out on this, I actually believe in ending the police. And the reason why I say it needs to be ended, and I love your opinion on this, is because at this point in time, at least I can only talk about the culture in Southern New England. The policing culture in Southern New England is so combative, so thoroughly broken in terms of his relationship with the community, so thoroughly corrupted, that I believe we need to then start from scratch on a local level, where you've got a instead of this top-down hierarchical organization who sees success. I can only speak for my local area. I don't speak for the rest of the country.
That's okay. Keep going.
But who sees success in an arrest rate. That's how they judge success, not in the overall level of true criminality that happens. What I mean by criminality, I think where we will agree is violent crime and property crimes, not, if you will, behavior. I think we all understand at this point in our nation's history, we should, that you can't legislate people's behavior. So you can certainly have, if you will, things enforced if they hurt people while they engage in a behavior. But if we as a nation support body autonomy, then in fact, if one chooses to use drugs, we all know it's not a good choice. But as someone likes to say, no one looks to grow up to be a crack addict. No one wakes up and says, you know what, today's the day I'm going to become a cocaine addict. So you by then making policing a community driven, then that community has far more control over what is deemed as criminality, as opposed to the current model where I don't want to say routinely, but multiple times in the last couple of years, I'm that dope with the camera in the middle of what's becoming escalating into a potential riot. And I
And some
see
cop doesn't like it.
I see battle rattle. I call them the Providence Providence, if you will, special force. I call them the Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles because that's exactly what they look like when they come out and in march formation, walking into a community that's been, in my humble opinion, under siege by police for generations. You know, there was an organization in Providence, Rhode Island called the Jump Out Boys, and the Jump Out Boys weren't because they were jumping out of their car high-fiving people. They routinely drove up onto a curve, jumped out when they saw anything at all could be construed as a probable cause, including alleged gang colors, and put these people, young people, into a criminal database and treated them. These are people's kids. Treated them like they would already prejudge them as a criminal element.
Right.
And so, how do we expect to run our communities? And is it
first of all,
possible to
let me
reach?
say that yeah, I agree with everything you said. Everything you said is true. I don't think it adds up to your conclusion. In other words, yeah, there's a lot of things wrong, a lot of things we have to do differently. I'm a big believer in reform, and we should talk about that. And we can talk about that in some detail, as well as at the 30,000-foot level. There's a lot of reforms that we need to make to criminal justice generally and police management particularly. But I don't think that adds up to we no longer need police.
Oh,
right?
I think we need police. I mean, and hear me out. You see, my problem is not in a desire to reform the current force. I just don't know in parts of the country if it's possible to reform the current force. We've got a lawsuit.
Do you mean with those same individuals, or do you mean with the same manager? Yeah. Okay.
Same everything. I mean, the culture, the whole culture is screwed right now. You know,
yes. I hesitate to use the word many because it sounds like I have statistics, but in some places, the culture is so bad that it begs the question of how could you ever turn it around. Police culture can change relatively quickly. It takes a lot of managerial effort. It takes a lot of structural change to manage police officers differently. I don't think that this Democratic Party slogan of defunding the police, I think it's a very lazy approach. I don't think it makes any sense. And I don't think the people that say that actually know, literally, I don't think they know what they're talking about. As an example, if I told you that the police department was going to be more effective with half as much money and you believed it, I would question you, like, why would you believe such a thing? If I brought you 10 police officers, each of whom was willing to do the job for $29,000 a year, would you want them? Of course not. We should be expecting more from our police officers these days, not less. We should be expecting more sophistication, more sensitivity, more awareness, more of a community-driven attitude than ever before. That doesn't come free, right? We want a market for police officers, the same way that we just discussed a market for teachers. We want a market for police officers. It's more like other industries. We want union contracts to be reformed so it's easier to fire the bad ones, pay the good ones more than the bad ones, promote the good ones. We want a market between departments so that we can move people around in a way that that makes sense. In other words, portable pensions. On the disciplinary front, we want more accountability. We want more transparency regarding that discipline. We want communities to be more involved. I'm a big believer in, I'm not a big believer in politicians, but I'm a big believer in the fact that politicians have jobs and that at the local level, those jobs include being involved with the police departments for which you're responsible. If you don't know how police officers are being hired and trained in your community, and you're the commissioner or you're the mayor, shame on you. If you don't know what's going on in that union contract negotiation, shame on you. I'll give you an example of which I'm not terribly proud or happy, but it is the truth. I was sitting in on our most recent, couple years ago, union contract with our city. We don't have a giant police department. We're talking about 100 officers. Big enough to have a little union and a union contract, but not big in a real world sense. And we said we wanted a certain raise. We want a 5% raise, and the city says, "Oh, we only want to give you a 2% raise," and then you start haggling, right? Well, I'm sitting there waiting for the city to tell us what else it is that they wanted, right? I mean, surely these people, the commissioners, the city manager, the mayor, surely these people have television sets. They know what's going on in the United States. Surely they know what's going on in their community. Surely they're going to ask for greater accountability and more flexibility in terms of discipline. Surely they're going to ask to be involved in determining what the path of training is going to be. They didn't ask for anything. They asked for absolutely nothing other than to pay us less than we were asking for in a raise. That's how the negotiation went. I'm not saying that that ought to make us proud of the union. I'm just saying that you can't completely blame the unions when the politicians themselves have their heads in the sand. So I agree with you 100% that we need a tremendous amount of reform. But it's going to be hard work. We need to be willing to undertake that hard work and go after it.
Right.
It's going to be hard work in terms of figuring out what to do, hard work in terms of implementing it, but also hard work politically. Police officers are not naturally a group that's warm to change. So you got to bring those people along, right? And when necessary, bite the bullet and let go of the people that you just can't change. To your point, there may be whole parts of departments that have to go. I don't know. I'm not in your area.
Well, and again, I want to take the time we have on to cover a couple of issues, but I'll just say this, at least, and again, I can only speak for my area, but
it's not different. It's not completely different from a lot of others, I'm certain.
I'm just not sure, based on some of the behavior of local police here in Rhode Island, if they're in fact capable of reform at a high level and to do the sort of start from scratch necessary without literally starting from scratch. And I realize this is much more of a local issue than a federal issue, so I just want to shift away for a little bit, but it ties in obviously to the war on drugs, but it also ties in, if you will, to the overreaching federal government. The war on drugs creates a pipeline to prison and a pipeline to poverty that's unchallenged at this point. We know that. The failure, if you will, of the federal government to enhance education, instead diminish it, has led to people walking out of schools that are virtually warehouses. The just absolute warehouses. The third area of control of the government that leaves people in poverty is, quite frankly, their constant intrusion into if you will, into the economy, for lack of a better term. I know that's a cliche, but I'll give you one example. Under the Trump administration, a law was passed that allowed and created, if you will, positive capital gain treatments and some other accoutrements, if you will, to investing in what was called blighted zones. Now, of course, who doesn't want to invest in a blighted zone? Well, here's what happened, at least in New England. You've got a pretty interesting interpretation of what a blighted zone is. It might be an area that you've been looking to redevelop all along. So you get in bed with a politician who calls it a blighted zone. That area then is redeveloped, fancy stuff is built, and the housing stock in the area is depleted. Part of it is literally wiped off the face of the earth in order to build these fancy developments. These fancy developments, whether it be stadiums or malls or all sorts of great stuff, is completely out of the reach of the participation of the people who live in the community. So it's a perfect example of the government intruding into the private sector, into the free market, and screwing the very people that they quote,
leaving it more difficult for people to live in it than before.
Right. And housing is another example of that. The
housing is a horrific example. We do so many different things to screw up the housing market. I'm surprised anyone has a roof over their head at all. When you consider the zoning that makes it difficult for affordable housing to be where it needs to be, and we also incentivize, and I want your reaction to this. As a state, and I'm sure Florida does this, I know Rhode Island does it, the state and the federal government constantly incentivizes through tax treatments and loans and grants and everything else, the creation of very often developments that are out of the reach of the lower middle class to working poor. And in doing so, they create incentives
for the market to steer away from where the true market needs are, which are affordable housing, and should be built in the private market. What's your reaction to that?
Well, you're absolutely right. The private market has to be the driver of the allocation of the resources. So often, I think federal officials don't understand that it's not just a matter of making resources go. It's a matter of where they go that the federal government has to allow to the market. I also believe that the same thing can be said for the people finding the housing. In other words, some of these communities that we're talking about, they are not healthy places for people to remain for one generation and another. They are places from which people ought to be moving. But so often we subsidize housing in a particular place that's not healthy, creating an incentive for them to stay there, because we have zoning ordinances that preclude the affordable housing from being nearby elsewhere, or God forbid, in a higher income area where the public schools are any good. So it is absolutely the equivalent of an industrial policy for housing that misallocates the location of so many development projects. Yes, we have development projects all the time that the locals cannot afford, but because of tax policy, it's going to make it work, right? Call it the tax tail wagging the investment dog, right? Just bad, what would otherwise be investments that weren't made, but they are because of tax incentives. It's a huge problem. And of course, the federal government also participates through welfare programs in creating incentives for all kinds of mischief in incentivization, right? We still, 50 years after the inception of the war on poverty, we still incentivize the breakup of the nuclear family. It's not something that's terribly politically correct to talk about these days, because we're supposed to be completely flexible, and we are, as a matter of culture and as a matter of ethics. But as a matter of economics, there's no justification for federal subsidization in the directions in which welfare goes these days. So for all of these reasons added up, we have a very difficult time for people to work their way out of poverty, notwithstanding all kinds of money being poured into these areas in arguably pernicious ways. I had the opportunity the other day, Pat, to participate in a forum with the Democratic candidates in District 20. And notwithstanding the fact that these are people that we're all familiar with in some sense, in most cases as individuals, you see them in the news and you see them around, you see them online, you read their stuff, you know what they're going to say, you know what they're going to talk about. But to participate in an online conversation with them in real time is truly breathtaking. Just one bad idea after another. They truly believe that fighting poverty is a matter of finding money from someplace else and bringing it into my district, whether it's a contract or a subsidy or more money for public schools.
Set-asides, the ilk.
Yeah.
What and that let's get to the campaign for a few minutes here. That's outstanding. You were able to, in effect, go toe to toe with these folks politely, I'm sure. Who held this forum, and where was it, and what was the
Alpha Kappa Alpha is a sorority of women nationwide who participate in politics and held this online forum. The League of Women Voters will have another one in September coming up. You call it toe to toe, but it's really, your toes against toes and toes and toes and toes and toes and toes and toes.
I know the feeling.
Because not only are you the only libertarian in the race, but there aren't any Republicans that participate in the forum. And so we had 7, 8 Democrats and me. And these are not Democrats that are, they don't even claim to be Bill Clinton new style Democrats. These are people who, well, let me give you an example. Sheila Shurfless McCormick, who is arguably the leader in this race, is promising $1,000 a month for everybody for free, for doing nothing, to be
That's
paid
good.
for by the federal government, just for you being you, Pat.
Oh, that's great. Where do
Yeah.
I sign up? Where do I sign up?
Well, it was all I could do. The folks that I talked to in the Libertarian Party of Broward County, the greatest libertarian affiliate in the world, of course, my folks counseled me, no, you should not go online and say, I'll offer 1,100. But as you might imagine, it would cross one's mind, right?
Right. No, I guess I could tell you're a fighter. So as difficult as those circumstances are, they're really the best because I, I have a feeling you enjoyed thoroughly the engagement, as unfair as it probably was, as stilted as it probably was, as completely the rhetoric being completely outside of this universe, as the rhetoric probably was. Those are the best times. Am I to believe then that the Republicans are sort of non compos mentis in this? Are they sitting on the sidelines for this one? Is it a two-person race, or have they at least put a name in there?
They have a name in there. It's a very Democratic area, as we talked about. A couple of elections ago, the Republicans didn't even run anybody. But when they do run somebody, it's typically 80-20 in the final tally, Democrat to Republican. There are a couple of Republicans who are signed up. I guess they chose not to participate in the forum. I mean, I could imagine why. You know, there's nothing that is either personally comfortable or possibly not even politically tractable for them. So maybe they just chose to skip this particular forum. That's a tactical decision. I'll leave that to them. But they'll have their primary in November, and then it'll be down to one Republican, one Democrat, and myself. For some reason, there weren't any other libertarians that wanted to jump in and have our own little primary for the right to participate in this race. And yes, the fact that it's a tough district is part of, I don't know if I'd use the word fun, but it is part of the reason for doing it. We do believe, everyone involved in this campaign believes that it's very, very important for us to work hard at getting the message out. Most of the people in District 20 have never seen the word libertarian, much less an individual who would call himself one. And the opportunity to explain how we feel about issues, it's just absolutely worth its weight in gold. I spent a lot of time passing out material in the Walmart parking lots. And
Yep.
I'll tell you, besides sunburn, you get a lot of good conversations. You know, once in a while, someone will be mad at you for something, but I suspect that would be the case whether you were a Democrat or Republican also. But you do get a lot of productive conversations, and people agree with you on principles, even if they haven't heard of your party before. So it's very rewarding in that sense. Yes.
No, again, someone with your background, I know, has never shied away from an opportunity to confront madness. My sense is you're one of those people who's one of the first people running into the building. And
I'm naturally very shy and like to watch the youngsters run into burning buildings, but I'll do the paperwork for them.
They're very fair enough. Like you, I embrace those situations. Put me right down into the middle of it. And libertarians need to do that. It's hard. Libertarians by many measures are not, we have a hell of a good time with each other, but we're not, take the hill by storm crowd. We're not the, but we need to be.
Yeah, and I suppose we have the same mix of personalities as a lot of other groups, but you're right, and I think that a piece of that is that libertarians are not by our nature sufficiently pro-government or public sector to have immersed ourselves in some of the nuances of certain issues, if you know what I mean. some of these issues are so frustrating. Why would you bang your head against a wall to understand why things are the way that, certain things are? Why does the federal government do some of the stupid things it does? What are the histories behind them? Why do people embrace these things? Why do politicians embrace them? Why do voters embrace them? It can get complicated. It can get tedious. And by the way, I don't have the answers either, right? I've run into burning buildings, and turns out it wasn't burning, and it wasn't even the right building. But I do think that we need to engage and ask. And by doing that, for example, one of the things that I discovered in District 20 is the number one issue is police reform. As much as I like talking about the things that drive poverty, not everyone else does. And I wonder, I don't have good data on this, but I wonder if some people even realize that the reasons they're stuck in poverty, or even some people even realize they're in poverty.
Right.
They realize they don't have enough money. They realize they had, wish they had more. But do they realize the opportunities that are out there for others? Do they realize how good schools are that they've never seen?
I would argue my personal experience is they're missing a point of reference, and their frustration at this point is turned to outrage, and which in that outrage sometimes could be misdirected because of just how opaque, government is, and then that outrage lashes out indiscriminately, and that's not because folks aren't smart. It's just because they've been told and sold a bill of goods. And
you're right. And without that point of reference, as you point out, as you say, none of us would realize where we fit into the universe ourselves. So right. I think you're exactly right. I worked for a couple of years part-time as a substitute teacher in Broward County. Mm-hmm. And I have to admit, it was an eye-opening experience for me. I raised two kids. One went to public schools and one went to private schools in high school. And you learn a lot by the comparison. And they used to go back and forth. We were in a private school, then a public school, and a private school, and a public school. And then one went one direction, one went another direction for high school. But you learn a lot about the resources that are available and what works and what doesn't. The other eye-opening experience, Pat, is that when I was working in and around the government, when I lived outside of Washington, D.C., I lived in Arlington, one of the finest public school districts in the world. The difference now, of course, I didn't have a good point of reference at that point either. I just thought, gee, public schools aren't all that bad.
Right.
We had several that were really good.
Yeah.
I learned when I moved to Broward County, I learned how good my public schools were in Arlington.
Right.
I wouldn't have known that. And
no, I understand completely. Yeah, no, it is, and you have to open people's eyes, and for those eyes that have been opened, very often they're the ones sitting in a line for a lottery for a spot in a charter school, which by comparison to the local failed public school must seem like it's literally heaven for their children, and that's why, and it's unfair that some of the mischaracterizations, of people in marginalized communities about them not caring about their children are frankly ludicrous, because these are people who very often are working multiple jobs and or again finding ways to try to get their kids into better situations.
Of course it's ludicrous indeed. In many of these communities, their children are the only things that they can afford to care about. They spend their whole lives, every waking moment, and more moments awake than most of us, doing nothing but trying to take care of their kids in every way that is imaginable. And the federal government and their local government and their state government are doing very little to help them, notwithstanding the money that gets spent. It's a heartbreaker.
Absolutely. Well, we're just about out of time. So we talked about this in the run-up. First of all, John, we want to just mention before you get into your shameless self-promotion that the New York Libertarian Party is having a very special event Saturday evening, September 25th at 5 p.m. in New Rochelle, New York. It's an evening with Larry Sharpe. And it's really, I think, going to be the kickoff to a phenomenal year for the LPNY. Folks can go up to their Facebook page, and we'll provide a link at some point. But they can go up to their Facebook page and purchase tickets. And there's so many good things that are going on in New York. It's important that we support them in any way possible. At the same time, they continue to be confronted with these exogenous challenges by a corrupted, if you will, election process in New York, where they constantly move the goalposts on these folks. So Larry Sharpe, who campaigned nobly, extensively, exhaustively around the Empire State, to get in an attempt to win the gubernatorial race, but at the same time to get party status for the New York Libertarian Party, was then rewarded this past year with them moving the goalposts again. So folks need to.
Are you telling me or the rest of your audience, Pat?
No, I'm telling everybody.
I thought you were speaking to me personally. I'm a huge Larry fan, and he has done a lot to support other candidates as well.
Right.
And I noticed it was at the Radisson.
Yep.
I would encourage anyone who can be close enough to hear our voices to, if you haven't worked with Larry, if you haven't seen Larry in person, you're in for a treat.
Right. It'll be a wonderful evening. New Rochelle is, for those not familiar, is in that just north of Manhattan, in northeast of Manhattan, right along on the run up about an hour and a half from the Connecticut border. So if you're anywhere in New England or in Jersey, see if you can get up there, stay overnight, because they're also, as my kids would say, the guys and gals from New York are hella fun to party with. So make sure you take advantage of the opportunity. By the way, folks, if you are a Libertarian affiliate and you have a major fundraiser come out that you would love to just put up on LPTV, just let us know, and we'll be certain to, as we say, promote it so that we let the rest of the nation know what you're doing. Mike, take it away. Tell us how folks can contribute to your campaign and how they can support you, volunteer, work remotely. I mean, I'm intrigued to know if folks in Florida are starting to take advantage of this remote texting capability or remote dial-in or things like that in order to take advantage of volunteers from outside the region. But lay it out for us.
Yeah, absolutely. Look, the easiest way to learn something in a hurry about the campaign is to go to the website, right? MikeTerMaat2022.com. Of course, you got to spell it right. MikeTerMaat 2022.com. My phone number posted there is my real phone number. It's the cell phone I carry in my pocket. Feel free to text me, reach out. You'll find the links to the Twitter and the Facebook page. We have a fundraiser coming up with Spike Cohen on September 3, a dinner with Cuban food. It's inexpensively priced. And if you haven't dealt with Spike in person, that is a real opportunity. Spike is a great guy. Spike is one of those guys who is not just a I hate government guy. Spike actually cares about humans. He actually wants the world to be a better place. Right. So if you're interested in such a person, I mean, that's not for everybody, right? That's not everyone's cup of tea. But if you like those kind of people, Spike will be with us on September 3rd, and then we're going to go for an airboat ride on September 4. And we're telling Spike, don't let him know this. It's an inside joke, but apparently folks close to Spike are telling him that there's going to be a scuba or at least a snorkel opportunity in the Everglades. And just before he jumps off the boat, we're going to tell him not to. So that's September 4. Martha Cohen, who's running for Miami Commission, has an event with Spike on the 5th and an event on the 4th. And Martha is a terrific libertarian candidate in Miami, a Cuban American and someone who's standing up for the position that we should be taking vis-a-vis the Cuban population, the Cuban government. And everything that's going on there. So she is someone that we should be supporting as well, and she'll be speaking at our event. So a lot of exciting things going on, people helping us get the message out. And as you pointed out, Pat, that really is what it's all about.
Excellent. Well, please stay in touch. We'd love to hear from you. That week, how things are going. Send us pictures, if you will, of the fundraiser you do with Spike, particularly if you do take them on a trip into the Everglades. We want pictures as proof, and we'll be sure to post them up here with acknowledgement for your campaign. Listen, God bless, lad. It sounds like you're in for the adventure of your life. Just if I could quote, and I'll probably do it incorrectly, a song from a tribal rock group from the 1960s, the Grateful Dead. Too much of everything is just enough. So,
well, let's keep it legal then. Let's make legal the things they were talking about.
There you go, buddy. So, folks, listen. Take the time. Again, this is going to be another challenging week for the Libertarian Party. We're going into an LNC meeting that is certain to attract controversy, and that will take folks' eye off the ball. And it's critical that not happen, to whatever degree possible, that not happen. Emotional issues will be discussed. Personalities will be challenged. And people will get frustrated. So when that happens, there's a pretty simple solution. Go to Mike's website. Send him a couple bucks. Read up on his campaign. See if there's something you can do remotely if you're not blessed enough to live in the greater Fort Lauderdale, Florida metropolitan area. Or if you want to do something more local, go up on a Facebook and look at the dozens and dozens of interviews we've done here. Go onto your local affiliate's website and see who is running for office locally. Our future as a party, as a movement, as a philosophy remains how we support people like Mike. It's really that simple. And while the distractions will occur, while emotions will run high this week, let's step aside and consider what's really important. And it's these ground battles, if you will, the hand-to-hand political combat that takes place when a candidate like Mike, Natalie from Oklahoma, Stacy from New York City, Greg from New Jersey, whether they be for the United States Congress, whether they be for gubernatorial races, the dozens and dozens of folks running under the Milton maneuver in Pennsylvania, running for hyper-local offices. That's what's important. Because that's how we will disseminate, preach to, proselytize, encourage, coach, mentor the libertarian philosophy, the libertarian message, if you will, and of course, our statement of principles and our amazing platform. That is what needs to happen. Folks, you've been listening to Candidates Corner on LPTV, Libertarian Party Television, a production of the Libertarian Party and Libertarian National Committee. Whitney Bilyeu serving as chair. Again, a tremendous thanks to John Gapso on the big board. Without his twice weekly volunteer services, we could not make this happen. I'm your host, Pat Ford. As always, it is a singular honor to spend time with you. Most importantly, it is an honor for me to spend time with people like Mike and all the folks I mentioned and all the folks who have gone before him, because I'll leave you with this thought. There is no act more patriotic other than serving in our nation's defense and willing to sacrifice your personal life, your private time, very often your own personal resources, in service to one's community, looking to steward the community's resources, its talents, its people. Have a wonderful week. We'll be on the air Monday night. I believe we're going to be talking Molten Maneuver again. We're going to do sort of a little bit of follow-up with that. Importantly, Chris Thrasher is going to be on as well Monday evening. We're going to be talking about, well, ballot access, the two dirtiest words other than those 9 letters of acronyms that I started out with the show with. Ballot access, ballot petitioning. We're going to talk all about that on the Affiliate Corner, the Affiliate Spotlight, Monday night, 9 o'clock on LPTV. Folks, stay safe this weekend. Get engaged. It's time to go to war. We'll see you soon.